The afternoon sun hung low over the Hendersons' backyard, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The pool glittered like a sapphire set in concrete, perfectly maintained, perfectly inviting, and perfectly off-limits to Corinne Mitchell. She stood at the gap in the fence, her manicured fingers pressed against the loose board she discovered 3 weeks ago while jogging past the property. She'd been watching, waiting, learning their patterns. Marcus Henderson worked late most Thursdays. His wife, Sophia, had yoga until 6 p.m. on the same day. Their son was away at college. The house would be empty. Today was Thursday. Corinne wore a white bikini that cost more than most people's monthly car payment, though her credit cards were maxed out and her alimony check was 3 days late. The divorce from Brad had left her suspended in a specific kind of hell, not poor enough for sympathy, not rich enough to maintain the lifestyle she believed she deserved. She'd moved into a studio apartment in the Garden District, a fact she'd hidden from everyone who mattered. As far as her friends knew, she was between homes, while her interior designer selected materials. The truth was uglier, the truth was desperate. She squeezed through the gap in the fence, her toned legs carrying her across the manicured lawn. The grass was cool under her feet. She was immediately aware of how different this felt from her own life. Everything here had that quality of being cared for, of having been chosen and maintained by someone who actually had money. Not the performative money Corinne had pretended to have. Real money. Generational money. The back porch was empty. Through the glass doors, she could see the kitchen, immaculate and bright, the kind of kitchen that appeared in magazines. Corinne's throat tightened. She'd had a kitchen like this once. Before Brad decided that his pharmaceutical sales job made him attractive enough to trade in his wife of 17 years for a 26-year-old yoga instructor named Brittany. She'd been Brittany once, a long time ago. The pool beckoned. She descended the steps slowly, luxuriating in the first moment of immersion when the cool water covered her ankles, her calves, her knees. The house remained silent. The fence blocked the view from the street. She was, for the first time in months, entirely alone in a space that made her feel like the person she used to be. Corinne swam 3 perfect laps, each stroke measured and graceful. She floated on her back and let the sun warm her face. She pulled herself out and lay on one of the loungers, Egyptian cotton she'd bet, probably more expensive than her current rent, and closed her eyes. She was so absorbed in the fantasy of the moment, in the temporary suspension of her fallen circumstances, that she almost didn't hear the first sound. It was a shift in the air, really, a quality of attention, a sense of being observed. Corinne opened one eye. Standing at the edge of the patio, perfectly still, was a German shepherd. Black and tan, massive and alert, his dark eyes fixed on her with the kind of laser focus that suggested this was not his first encounter with strangers. For a moment, neither moved. The dog's name was Brutus, though Corinne didn't know it. He was 3 years old, trained in protection protocols, and programmed with an almost supernatural sensitivity to boundary violations. He'd been a gift to Marcus Henderson from a grateful client, a retired federal agent who'd taken the Henderson family under his wing after Marcus had helped him navigate a complex business situation. Brutus took his job seriously. "Nice dog," Corinne said, attempting a smile. "Good boy." Brutus's ears twitched, his tail did not wag. Corinne's mind raced. Had Sophia come home early? She sat up slowly, trying to appear casual, as if she had every right to be here, as if she belonged. I'm a friend of Sophia's," she called out, even though there was no one to hear her. The house behind the dog remained silent. "We were just going to swim together. She said I could come over." Brutus took a step forward. His hackles rose slightly, rippling along his spine. That was when Corinne made her first mistake. She stood quickly, too quickly, and Brutus's protective instincts shifted into high gear. He didn't bark, not yet, but his muscles tensed, coiled like springs, and his gaze never left her face. "It's okay," Corinne said, trying to modulate her voice into the soothing tones she'd heard dog trainers use. "I'm leaving, I'm just going to go. Easy, boy." She moved toward the gap in the fence, the one that had let her in so easily. Brutus followed, not attacking, but hurting her, his presence forcing her into a more direct path toward the fence. If she'd been thinking clearly, Corinne might have found this interesting. The dog wasn't trying to hurt her, just to remove her from the territory. He was being remarkably civilized about it. But Corinne wasn't thinking clearly anymore. She was thinking about how her afternoon escape, her moment of fantasy, was ending. She was thinking about returning to her studio apartment, to the roommate situation she'd been living with, another divorce statistic, another woman displaced by a younger model, to the slow, suffocating compression of her life into smaller and smaller spaces. She was thinking about rage. "Fine," she snapped at the dog. "I'm going, happy." She reached the fence and was just squeezing through when Brutus activated his secondary protocol. It wasn't a physical attack. It was something more sophisticated. Embedded in his collar, calibrated to his specific patterns of distress, was a canine alarm system, the kind of high-tech device that sent notifications to an app on the owner's phone while also emitting a sound designed to alert the household to a security breach. The alarm was ear-splitting. The sound filled the afternoon like a physical thing, a wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It echoed off the fence, the house, the surrounding properties. It cut through Corinne's shock and immediately flooded her nervous system with adrenaline. She moved on pure instinct. She sprinted back through the gap, back across the lawn, back toward the pool gate. Brutus followed, still not attacking, still hurting, but now the alarm was doing his job for him, creating chaos, creating urgency, creating the kind of adrenaline response that turned thinking people into panicked animals. Corinne yanked at the gate latch. It opened onto the driveway. Beyond that was the street. Beyond that was escape. She was through the gate and 3 houses down before she looked back. Brutus stood at the property line, still barking, still alert, still watching. He didn't chase. His job wasn't to pursue. His job was to contain and report, and he'd done both beautifully. Corinne didn't stop running until she was back in her car, 3 blocks away, hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Her white bikini was soaked. Her phone was in her purse on the passenger seat, and she didn't have the courage to look at it. Her mind was reeling with one single catastrophic fact. She'd been recorded. Security cameras. There had to be security cameras. The Hendersons weren't the type of people to have expensive alarm systems without cameras. She sat in her car in the parking lot of a 7-Eleven and forced herself to breathe. In and out. In and out. The same technique she'd learned in the therapy sessions Brad had paid for, the ones that were supposed to help her process being discarded. The summer light was beginning to fade. Somewhere across town, an alarm had gone off. Somewhere in that house, Marcus Henderson's phone was probably lighting up with notifications. He was seeing images of her now. A woman in a white bikini floating in his pool like she owned it. A woman trespassing. A woman who'd violated the sanctity of his property, his privacy, his family's security. Corinne started the car. She told herself it was an impulsive moment, a one-time thing. She'd been stressed, lonely, disconnected from her former life. She wouldn't do it again. She'd find other ways to cope. She'd get the studio apartment situation sorted out. She'd rebuild, But even as she told herself these things, she was already thinking about the next Thursday, already imagining how she might disable the alarm, already calculating whether she could get inside the house itself. Because here was the thing about Corinne Mitchell. She'd never been good at accepting her diminishment, and she'd never been particularly good at respecting other people's boundaries. She'd spent the intervening week in a state of fractured thinking, her mind splitting between self-recrimination and justification. She'd done research, actual research, learning about the alarm system, reading reviews online, understanding how the app notifications worked. She'd driven past the Henderson house multiple times, watching the patterns, nodding when the housekeeper came Tuesdays and Fridays, when delivery trucks arrived inconsistent, when neighbors might be outside rarely, they all had gates and private driveways. She'd also, and this was the part that made her skin crawl when she thought about it too directly, located Sophia's yoga schedule by following her Instagram account. Thursday, 4 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. This had been consistent for the past 3 weeks. Marcus usually didn't leave the office until 6:30 or 7 p.m. on Thursdays. The window was tight but manageable. The alarm would be a problem, of course, but Corinne had a plan. She'd purchased a small jamming device online, the kind of thing that technically wasn't supposed to exist, but absolutely did, available to anyone with a credit card and the willingness to order from sellers in countries where such legalities were. Flexible. The device wouldn't disable the alarm system, but it would create enough interference to prevent the alarm from triggering the app notification. The alarm itself would still activate, would still alert the household, but Marcus's phone wouldn't register it. That gave her 5, maybe 10 minutes of buffer time. It wasn't a good plan, But Karen had moved past the place where she was making good decisions. She parked her car 2 blocks away, in a residential area where her aging Lexus wouldn't stand out. She wore dark clothes, a necessity she was beginning to understand on some level that alarmed her, and carried a small bag. In the bag were a pair of gloves, a change of clothes, and a series of tools she'd spent the afternoon acquiring from a hardware store she didn't normally visit. The gap in the fence was still there, still loose, still welcoming. This time she didn't go directly to the pool. This time she moved toward the back door of the house. Her heart was hammering against her ribs in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. She was crossing a line. She was fully aware of it, and some part of her, a part that got smaller and quieter every time she rationalized one more step, knew that crossing this line changed everything. The back door had a simple lock. Karen had watched a YouTube video, twice. The screwdriver went into the space between the door and frame, and with a gentle pressure, the lock gave way. It was almost disappointing how easy it was. She was inside. The kitchen smelled like someone else's life, expensive coffee, fresh flowers, the kind of subtle luxury that came from having everything you touched chosen with care. Karen moved through it like a ghost, barely breathing. Her hands were shaking. She clenched them into fists, forcing them to be still. The house revealed itself to her as she moved. The living room was decorated in whites and golds with artwork that actually looked like original pieces. A piano. Of course they had a piano. Sophia played, Karen realized, looking at the sheet music propped against the stand. Chopin, advanced, beautiful. There were photographs everywhere. Family portraits, Marcus and Sophia on their wedding day, both glowing with the specific satisfaction of people who'd gotten exactly the life they planned for. Their son's graduation photo. A vacation shot of the three of them in what looked like the Mediterranean. Karen stood in front of the family photos for longer than she should have. Long enough to feel the envy crystallizing in her chest, hardening into something uglier than jealousy. Something darker. Something that whispered that these people didn't deserve this life. That they'd been given what should have been hers. That the universe owed her a correction. She moved upstairs. Marcus's office was on the second floor. A room lined with books, with a view of the backyard, with a desk that held only a laptop and a photograph of his family. Karen stood at the window and watched the pool below, glittering and empty and waiting for her. But first, she had something else to do. Sophia's jewelry box was on her dresser in a bedroom that smelled like her perfume, something French, something that probably cost $300 an ounce. Karen looked at the pieces. A tennis bracelet, pearl earrings, a diamond necklace that was almost certainly worth more than her car. She didn't take anything. That wasn't the point. The point was knowing she could. The point was understanding that this life, this sanctuary, this world that had excluded her could be violated, could be taken, could be proven fragile. She moved to the closet. Sophia's clothes hung in perfect order, organized by color and season. Designer brands that Karen recognized, labels she used to shop at when Brad still thought she was worth investing in. The clothes were beautiful. The clothes were chosen. The clothes were an advertisement of a life well lived. Karen pulled out a dress, a Valentino pale blue, probably $6,000, and held it against herself in the mirror. She looked ridiculous. The dress belonged to someone else, someone better, someone who'd earned it. She hung it back and moved on. It wasn't until she was back downstairs that she realized how much time had passed. Her phone showed 5:47 p.m. Sophia would be on her way home. Marcus might already be leaving the office. Karen's window was closing. She moved toward the back door, her heart rate climbing again. She'd gotten away with it. She'd been inside the home of people who didn't even know her, had walked through their private spaces, had violated their sanctuary. Nothing had happened. No one had come. No consequence had found her. It was intoxicating. And it was addictive. She was back through the fence just as she heard an engine in the driveway. She moved quickly, kept her head down, didn't run. A woman jogging was normal. A woman jogging past the Henderson house was unremarkable. She made it to her car without incident, without eye contact, without anything that would later suggest she was the cause of the upcoming panic. Because there would be panic, Karen realized as she pulled away from the curb. Marcus would come home. He would check the security footage. He would see. Not her face, necessarily, but proof that someone had been inside his home. He would have to call the police. His wife would be frightened. His sanctuary would be invaded in all the ways that mattered. and Karen would be halfway across the city, eating Thai food alone in her studio apartment, pretending her neighbors snoring through the wall was just white noise. She told herself she wouldn't do it again. She told herself this was the peak of her descent, the moment where she would recognize herself in the mirror and pull back. But Karen had been telling herself lies for a long time now. She was very good at it. The next Thursday came, and the Thursday after that. Each time the obsession deepened. Each time she learned something new about the Henderson family. She understood that Marcus took calls from his office about a merger. She learned that Sophia was seeing a therapist. She saw the business card on the desk in the home office. She discovered that their son had broken up with his girlfriend. There was an email thread discussing it that Karen felt guilty about reading, though not guilty enough to stop. By the fourth Thursday, she had a key to the back door. She'd made it herself, using a mold from the lock and materials ordered online. It worked perfectly. By the sixth Thursday, she'd been inside the master bedroom when Sophia arrived home unexpectedly, having skipped yoga due to a migraine. Karen had hidden in the closet, barely breathing, while Sophia changed out of her clothes and took a nap. Karen had stood 6 feet away from a woman she'd never met, separated only by hanging clothes and the fabric of doors, and felt more alive than she had in months. It was on this Thursday, 3 weeks into her obsession, that Brutus finally made his move. He'd grown accustomed to her presence. Dogs, Karen had learned, were creatures of routine. If something happened enough times without resulting in harm, the threat response diminished. Brutus no longer barked when she came through the gate. He no longer followed her. He'd begun, in his limited way, to accept her. But Brutus was also protective, and he was observant. He knew the rhythms of his family's life. He knew that Karen did not belong. On that Thursday, as Karen was upstairs in the master bedroom, not doing anything specific, just standing in Sophia's closet, breathing in the scent of her life, she heard the front door open. Marcus had left work early. Karen's mind short-circuited. She couldn't think, couldn't plan, could only freeze. She heard Marcus's voice call out hello to an empty house. She heard him moving around downstairs. She heard him head toward his office. She was trapped. There was no way out without being seen. The front stairs were the only stairs. The back door was 3 rooms away and would require her to descend directly past his office. She was caught in her own obsession, drowning in the consequences she'd refused to see coming. Marcus was on the phone, she realized. His voice carried up through the open floor plan, explaining to someone that he had a headache, that he was going to work from home for the rest of the day. He was here. He was staying. Karen's breathing came in short, sharp gasps. She was still wearing dark clothes. Her gloves were in her pocket. Her shoes were on her feet, ready for running. Karen moved on pure animal instinct. She couldn't leave through the front. She couldn't wait it out. Every moment that passed increased the likelihood of discovery. Her only option was the master bathroom, connected to the bedroom, which had a door leading to the hallway adjacent to where Marcus was working. She moved silently, muscle memory from 3 weeks of careful exploration guiding her feet away from the boards that creaked. The bathroom was sleek and modern, all dark tile and glass, with a skylight letting in the fatting afternoon sun. She locked the door and leaned against it, trying to slow her breathing. Her phone buzzed. A message from her neighbor, coming home late, cool if I stay at my sister's. Karen ignored it. She couldn't think about anything except the fact that Marcus Henderson was now between her and her escape route. She considered the window. The bathroom was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the driveway. A fall from this height would break her legs. That was not an option. She could stay here, wait until he left. Sophia would come home eventually. Maybe she'd still go to yoga, maybe she wouldn't. If she didn't, then Karen would be trapped overnight, and eventually Marcus would need to use his master bathroom. The discovery would be inevitable. Time became strange and syrupy. Minutes felt like hours. Karen sat on the cold tile and tried to think through the logistics of her own capture. Was breaking and entering a felony? She believed it was. Would there be consequences beyond jail time? Almost certainly. Her record would be permanent. Her reputation, what was left of it, would be obliterated. She pressed her forehead against the cool tile and felt something inside her fracture further. Then she heard something that made her blood freeze. "Buddy," Marcus's voice came from the master bedroom. "Where are you going?" Brutus, he'd been outside in the yard, but now he was calling him in. Karen heard the dog's nails on the hardwood floors, heard the familiar sound of him jumping up on the bed. She heard Marcus settling in, probably on the master bed with his laptop and his headache and his dog. She was locked in the bathroom, separated from escape by a locked door, separated from that door by a bedroom, separated from that room by the simple fact that there was a man sitting on his bed watching his dog, entirely unaware that his sanctuary had been violated for weeks. Corinne's hands were shaking. Her breathing was ragged. She was on the edge of something, some cliff where reality and consequence finally made contact with her choices. She was going to be caught. There was no way around it. She was going to walk out of this bathroom, and Marcus was going to see her, and his face was going to register the violation, and then... Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from her banking app. Account overdrawn. The jamming device, the fake key materials, the gas driving back and forth to this neighborhood. She'd gone through her monthly budget trying to facilitate her own obsession. Corinne looked at her face in the mirror. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. When had she become this person? The woman who broke into other people's homes. The woman who stood in strangers' closets breathing in the scent of their lives. When had the break between the woman she was supposed to be and the woman she'd become so complete? She heard Marcus on the phone. He was talking to someone about a medication. His tone was clinical, professional. He was a man discussing his migraines with his doctor, completely unaware that 17 feet away, on the other side of a locked bathroom door, his sanctuary was housing a woman who'd become unmoored from reality. And then Corinne heard something else. "Buddy, why are you looking at the door like that?" Marcus had shifted on the bed. She could track his movements by the shifting of his voice. "What's wrong, boy?" Brutus had heard her. He'd smelled her. His dog senses had penetrated the locked door and alerted him to the presence of the woman who'd violated his home again and again, despite his initial warnings. But Brutus wasn't aggressive. He was puzzled. The woman was inside the house now, which broke the usual pattern. His training kicked in. He moved toward the bathroom door, his nails clicking against the hardwood. "What is it?" Marcus set down his phone. Corinne heard him getting off the bed. She heard his footsteps approach the bathroom. She heard him reach for the doorknob. Corinne pressed her back against the sink. Her hand went to her gloves, to her phone, to anything that felt like a weapon, though she had no weapons. She had nothing but the desperate certainty that her life was about to end in this bathroom. Marcus jiggled the doorknob. "Hello," he called out. "Who's in there?" Corinne's mouth went dry. She was 17 feet away from a man whose home she'd invaded. She was 7 feet away from a door between them. She was about to become infamous in the way she'd always feared, not as a woman who'd lost everything, but as a woman who'd tried to take what wasn't hers. She reached out slowly and opened the bathroom door. Marcus Henderson stood in his master bedroom, his expression a landscape of confusion and alarm. He was a man in his late 50s, fit, distinguished, with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd never been surprised by anything in his life. The surprise on it now was profound. "Who?" he started. "I'm sorry," Corinne said. The words came out small and broken. "I'm sorry, I wasn't going to." But she couldn't finish. She couldn't articulate what she wasn't going to do because she no longer knew. She hadn't been going to hurt him, but that seemed like the only explanation he would accept. She hadn't been going to steal anything, but that also seemed inadequate. What had she been doing? For 3 weeks, what had she been doing? Marcus's face shifted. The confusion resolved into clarity and then into something darker. Recognition. The understanding that his home had been entered without permission, repeatedly, systematically, by someone who'd been inside his wife's closet, inside his personal spaces, inside the sanctuary he'd built. "How long?" he asked quietly. Corinne didn't answer. She couldn't. "How long have you been breaking into my house?" "I didn't," Corinne started, but that was a lie and they both knew it. The evidence was everywhere. She was here. Literally, physically here, inside his locked bathroom, inside his home. "My wife," Marcus said, and his voice had taken on a specific kind of calm that was far more terrifying than anger. "Has she been here when you came?" Corinne shook her head. "But you've been watching her. You've been in her things." Corinne didn't answer. Brutus pressed against Marcus's leg, still puzzled by the woman's presence but reading the shift in his master's emotional state. The dog began to vibrate with protective instinct, the hackles rising on his spine, the older training re-emerging. "Get out," Marcus said quietly. "Get out of my house now." Corinne moved toward the bedroom door, but Marcus stepped sideways, blocking her path. He wasn't touching her, wasn't threatening her physically, but his presence was suddenly immense. He was no longer a confused man. He was a man in his own home, protecting his sanctuary, understanding that he'd been violated in the deepest way. "I'm calling the police," he said, reaching for his phone. "You are not leaving this house until they arrive. Do you understand me?" Karen understood. She understood that her choices, all of them, every single violation and justification and rationalization, had led to this moment. She understood that there was no version of this that ended well. She understood that she was a woman who'd broken into another woman's life and tried to steal something that had never been hers to take. She ran. She shoved past Marcus, not violently, but with surprising force, and bolted toward the stairs. Behind her, Brutus finally activated his full defensive protocol. The alarm system screamed to life, that same ear-splitting wail she'd heard 3 weeks earlier, except this time it was accompanied by the sound of Marcus's voice on the phone with 911. "There's a woman in my house," he was saying. "She's fleeing. I don't know who she is. She broke in. Yes, there's an alarm. Yes, she's leaving now." Karen was down the stairs and out the back door before he'd finished speaking. She ran across the lawn, through the gap in the fence, down the driveway, toward the street where her car was waiting like an escape pod. She made it 3 blocks before the police car pulled her over. They'd been nearby, responding to a burglary call 2 streets over. The dispatcher had radioed a description: a woman, dark clothes, moving quickly, and Karen fit it perfectly. The officer pulled her over with his sirens off, trying to keep it low-key, but the moment he approached her window, he knew. She was crying, she was shaking. She was wearing dark gloves in the heat of the summer evening. She was the obvious answer to a simple question: who had broken into the Henderson house? The police station was not what Karen had expected. She'd imagined it as a place of judgment, where officers would regard her with contempt, where the machinery of justice would process her quickly and efficiently into the criminal system. Instead, she found it to be bureaucratic and oddly mundane. A woman officer named Detective Torres processed her intake with the kind of detached professionalism that suggested she'd done this 1,000 times. "Name?" Torres asked, not looking up from the form. "Karen Mitchell." "Address?" Karen gave her the studio apartment address, watching Torres' eyes register the location as somewhere between struggling and desperate. "Occupation?" Karen opened her mouth. She'd spent 17 years as a homemaker. For the past year and a half, she'd done freelance event planning, work she no longer got because her reputation had preceded her. Before that, she'd modeled briefly in her 20s, a fact she'd learned to keep private because it made people uncomfortable. She'd been a golf course attendant. She'd worked the front desk at a gym. She'd taken jobs that paid cash and required no references. "Unemployed," she said finally. Torres nodded and continued writing. "You have the right to remain silent," she began, the words automatic and perfunctory. Karen had heard these words so many times on television that they'd become almost abstract, divorced from real consequence. Hearing them applied to her actual life created a strange disconnect, like watching a scene from a movie but feeling the cold metal of the chair under her hands. She'd been arrested, Karen realized, formally. She was in the system now. The interrogation room was small and gray, and had a mirror she knew was one-way glass. Detective Torres sat across from her with a file folder, which she opened slowly. "The Hendersons," Torres said, "have a very comprehensive security system. They have cameras covering every room of their house, every entry point, and both the front and back yards. They have an alarm system that logs every entry. They have documentation of over 30 separate intrusions spanning a 3-week period." Karen felt her stomach collapse. 30, she whispered. 30, Torres confirmed. "You broke in, Miss Mitchell, repeatedly. You accessed private spaces. You touched personal items. You hid in the bathroom while Mr. Henderson was home. This is not a minor incident." "I didn't take anything," Karen said. "I didn't hurt anyone, I just—" "You just what?" Torres' voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "Looked at their lives, stood in their closets, violated their sense of safety in their own home. Because I have to tell you, the psychological impact of what you did is actually pretty significant. Mrs. Henderson has already called her therapist. Mr. Henderson is considering installing additional security. They're both struggling to feel safe in their own home." Karen thought of Sophia. She thought of the expensive yoga classes that were now tainted by the knowledge that someone had been in her bedroom. She thought of the jewelry box she'd stood over, cataloging worth and beauty. She thought of the closet full of designer clothes that belonged to a woman who'd done nothing except inherit a better life. "I want a lawyer," Karen said quietly. Torres nodded and stood up. "That's your right, this interview is over." The public defender assigned to her case was a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, approximately Karen's age, with the exhausted demeanor of someone who'd spent too many years fighting battles that were already lost before they began. They met in a holding cell that smelled like desperation and industrial cleaner. "The evidence is overwhelming," Patricia said bluntly. "Security camera footage showing you inside the house multiple times, entry logs from the alarm system, the fake key they found in your car, the jammer device, the file on your phone with photos you took inside their home." "I didn't take photos," Karen said. "You took photos of Sophia's closet," Patricia corrected. "You took photos of their family portraits. You took photos of the master bedroom. All of this is on your phone. The prosecution is going to have an easy time with this." Karen's throat tightened. She'd forgotten about the photos. She'd taken them, yes, at some point during her obsession. The documentation of her violation seemed important. She wanted proof that she'd been inside, that she'd crossed the boundary. She wanted to remember. "What am I looking at?" Karen asked. "Breaking and entering is a felony," Patricia said. "Burglary, which this technically qualifies as even though you didn't take anything because you entered with intent to commit theft, is a felony. Stalking, which they can prove through the repeated entries and your surveillance of the family, is potentially a felony. You're looking at anywhere from 2 to 7 years depending on how many charges stick and whether the prosecutor decides to push for the maximum. This is serious, Miss Mitchell, very serious." Karen had known this intellectually, but hearing it out loud from a lawyer in an actual holding cell transformed the knowledge from abstract to concrete. "I was having a difficult time," Karen said. "I was going through a divorce. I lost my home. I was alone. I wanted to feel like I was still part of a life like that, a normal life." Patricia's expression didn't change. "The judge won't care about your circumstances. The Hendersons are pressing charges. They want restitution. They want you to understand the severity of what you did. And frankly, based on the security footage, they have every right to be furious." "Can we request a plea deal?" "We can request one, but I don't think the prosecution is going to be interested in negotiating. You broke into their home 30 times, Miss Mitchell. You violated their privacy repeatedly. You hid in their bathroom. You accessed their personal spaces. This isn't a situation where the prosecutor is going to look charitable." Patricia left her with the grim understanding that her life, as she'd known it, was over. Whatever career opportunities she'd had, whatever social standing remained, whatever possibility of rebuilding had seemed feasible, all of it was about to be erased by the simple fact that she'd been unable to contain her obsession. The trial, when it came 3 months later, was a media event. The local news picked it up because it had the elements of a good story. A woman obsessed with another woman's life, repeated break-ins, security footage showing her standing in the master bedroom. The headlines were brutal. "Local woman arrested for stalking wealthy couple, breaking in to fill the void. Obsessed woman invades Henderson home repeatedly." They didn't use her name initially, but they used her photograph, an old photo from when she was still married, still wearing the armor of the life that had fit her. Her face was broadcast on the evening news. Her violation was public. Everyone would know exactly what she'd done. The prosecution's case was airtight. Sophia took the stand and described the violation in clinical terms, though Karen could see the emotional toll it had taken. Sophia's hands shook as she described finding evidence of intrusion, of changing her locks, of no longer feeling safe in her own bedroom. She described the moment Marcus had discovered Karen in their bathroom, the violation of their sanctuary, the theft of their sense of security. "I know she didn't take anything," Sophia said, her voice steady but small. "But she took our peace. She took our trust in our own home, and I don't know if we'll ever feel the same way about that space again." Karen, sitting at the defense table, felt the weight of Sophia's words settle on her chest like a stone. The defense strategy was to present Karen's mental state, her depression following the divorce, her isolation, her dissociation from reality. A therapist testified that Karen showed signs of obsessive behavior and possible personality disorders. The implication was that she was unwell, unstable, more to be pitied than condemned. The judge didn't seem particularly moved by the argument. "The defendant," the judge said, his gaze fixed on Karen, demonstrated a pattern of deliberate, repeated, systematic violation of another family's privacy and safety. This was not an impulsive act. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a sustained campaign of trespass and stalking. The court finds the defendant guilty on all counts: breaking and entering, burglary, stalking, and unauthorized entry of a private residence. He paused, letting the weight of the verdict settle. She'd expected darkness and violence and the kind of chaos you saw in movies. Instead, she found a strange kind of order. Women processed in and out of the county jail with the efficiency of a factory. Karen was assigned a cell with a woman named Deshonda, who'd been arrested for passing bad checks and was waiting for her trial date. "First time?" Deshonda asked, not unkindly. Karen nodded. "Don't worry, county ain't so bad. It's state prison that gets rough. You're probably not going to state, not for what you did." Karen had appreciated the optimism, even though she didn't quite believe it. She had a hearing in 2 weeks. She'd be sentenced to prison, and then she'd learn exactly how rough her life could become. The waiting was the hardest part. The uncertainty. The understanding that her future was no longer hers to determine. Some external authority would decide how many years of her life she would spend locked away from the world, separated from what little remained of her life. She'd written letters to several people. A letter to Brad, explaining what had happened, though she wasn't sure she'd actually send it. A letter to her mother, who'd already informed Karen that she would prefer not to speak with her until this situation was resolved. As if Karen's incarceration was a social embarrassment rather than a consequence of her own choices. She'd tried to write a letter to Sophia but had given up after the first line. What could she possibly say that would matter? "I'm sorry I invaded your life?" That seemed inadequate. "I was going through a difficult time." That was her excuse, not her apology. The day of the sentencing hearing, Karen was transported to the courthouse in a van with 5 other women. She was the only one in her cell for the ride, which the guard told her was because of the media attention. The case had gotten bigger than the local news now. A podcast producer had reached out to Patricia, expressing interest in the story. Karen's violation had become entertainment for people with nothing better to do than listen to stories about real people's suffering. The courtroom was packed. Karen scanned the faces and found them: Marcus and Sophia Henderson sitting together in the second row, their hands linked. They looked exhausted. Sophia's eyes were red. Marcus's face was set in an expression of grim satisfaction, the look of someone who'd come to witness justice be done. There were reporters in the gallery. There were people with notebooks. There was a woman Karen recognized from the yoga studio where Sophia taught, sitting 2 rows back, watching with the kind of morbid curiosity that public destruction seemed to inspire in people. Karen's lawyer stood next to her, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. "The court has reviewed the defendant's history," the judge began, "her psychiatric evaluations, the circumstances of her case, and the impact on the victims. The defendant has shown no genuine remorse for her actions. She has attempted to frame her crimes as a result of psychological distress, rather than taking full responsibility for her deliberate choices. The court is not sympathetic to this framing." Karen's hands were shaking. Patricia put a hand on her arm, squeezing gently. "It is the judgment of this court that Karen Mitchell be sentenced to 5 years in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. She will be eligible for parole after serving 3 years and 4 months. The court further orders that the defendant pay restitution to Marcus and Sophia Henderson in the amount of $15,000 for security system upgrades, counseling, and emotional distress." 5 years, Karen had known it was coming, but hearing the number spoken aloud, official and final, transformed it into something real. 5 years. 5 years of her life gone. At 42 years old, she would be 47 when she was released. She would lose the prime years she had left. She would lose the possibility of rebuilding. She would become a woman defined entirely by this moment. "Miss Mitchell, do you wish to address the court?" the judge asked. Karen looked at Patricia. Her lawyer gave her a small nod. Karen stood on unsteady legs. She looked at the courtroom full of strangers, at the reporters with their phones ready to record her words, at Sophia Henderson, who was finally looking at her, really looking at her, for the first time since the trial began. "I'm sorry," Karen said, and she meant it. She meant it with a depth that surprised her. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for violating your home and your privacy and your safety. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I want you to know that I understand what I took from you. I understand that my actions had consequences, not just for me, but for your family. and I'm sorry." Sophia's expression didn't change. Marcus squeezed her hand. The judge nodded slightly. The court appreciates the defendant's statement. However, remorse expressed after conviction and sentencing is of limited value. The court stands by its sentence. This hearing is adjourned. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Central Women's Facility wasn't the worst prison Karen had expected, but it was the worst place she'd ever been. It was a warehouse for women's suffering, a place where 5 years could stretch out like eternity, where the days accumulated into seasons that accumulated into years. Karen was assigned to a cell with a woman named Jasmine, who was serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery and was surprisingly good at helping new inmates understand the social dynamics of incarceration. The first rule was invisibility. Be useful but not memorable. Be friendly but not close. Survive without drawing attention. Karen worked in the laundry, folding other women's clothes, the irony not lost on her. She'd spent weeks obsessing over Sophia Henderson's closet, over the texture and quality of her belongings. Now she spent 8 hours a day with her hands on the belongings of 50 other women, none of whom had anything worth obsessing over. She attended mandatory counseling, where a therapist named Dr. Raymond tried to help her understand what had driven her to her obsession. "It wasn't really about the Henderson family," Dr. Raymond said during one session. "It was about what they represented, a life you felt you'd lost, a status you felt you should have had, a sense that you'd been wronged by the universe and that invading their space could somehow correct that balance." "That doesn't sound like something that helps me," Karen said. "It's not about helping you," Dr. Raymond replied. "It's about helping you understand yourself. If you can't understand what drove your behavior, you can't prevent it from happening again." Karen understood it perfectly. She understood that she'd been a woman drowning, and instead of calling for help, she decided to pull someone else under with her. She'd believed that somehow invading Sophia Henderson's life would fill the empty spaces in her own. She'd been wrong. All she'd done was create more emptiness, in her own life and in theirs. She wrote letters she didn't send. She participated in prison programs that were supposed to rehabilitate her. She watched other women come and go, some released, some transferred to higher security facilities. She learned to exist in the space between hope and despair, in the gray middle where most of the long-term inmates lived. 4 years into her sentence, an email reached her through the prison system. Patricia had forwarded it. It was from a producer at a true crime podcast. They were doing an episode on Karen's case and wanted to interview her. They were offering payment, which could go toward her restitution to the Hendersons. Karen refused. The last thing she wanted was her story weaponized for entertainment. The last thing she wanted was to relive her obsession in front of thousands of strangers who would judge her without understanding her. But she did receive a letter, about 6 months before her parole hearing. It was from Sophia Henderson. Karen's hands shook as she opened it. The handwriting was neat, controlled, the script of a woman who had things together. "Dear Miss Mitchell, I've spent 4 years trying to decide whether to write this letter. I've struggled with what I want to say to you, whether I want to say anything at all. My therapist suggested that writing to you might help me gain closure, though I'm not sure that closure is possible. What you did violated something fundamental in me. For years after your arrest, I couldn't sleep in my bedroom without thinking about the fact that you'd been there. I couldn't use my closet without wondering what you'd touched, what you'd looked at, what you'd taken from me without taking anything that could be replaced. But I've come to understand something. You didn't steal my life. I spent a lot of anger on you, and some of that anger was justified, but much of it was displaced. The truth is, I've been mourning my life too, though for different reasons than you mourned yours. I had the things you wanted, the house, the marriage, the security, and I was still unhappy. I was still struggling. I was still going to therapy, still questioning my choices, still wondering if I was enough. I'm not writing this to minimize what you did. You committed a crime. You violated my family's safety. You deserve to have served the time that was given to you. But I'm writing this to tell you that I've forgiven you. Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to my anger about what you did has been more of a prison than the one you're in. I hope you find a way to rebuild when you're released. I hope you find meaning in whatever comes next. And I hope you understand that the life you wanted to steal doesn't exist anywhere except in imagination. Sophia. Karen read the letter 5 times. She cried when she read it. She read it while sitting on her bunk with Jasmine respectfully looking away. She read it while lying in the dark, trying to understand whether Sophia was offering forgiveness or simply releasing herself from the burden of anger. She wrote back, but the letter felt inadequate. She told Sophia that she understood. She told her that she was sorry again, though she knew those words had lost their power through repetition. She told her that she hoped Sophia had found peace, even if that peace had come from within herself rather than from any action of Corinne's. Corinne's parole hearing came on a Tuesday in early spring. She wore the clothes she'd been given when she arrived, generic prison issue, worn smooth by washing, and sat in front of a board of 3 evaluators who had her file in front of them. "You've served 4 years and 3 months of your 5-year sentence," the board chair, a woman named Margaret Foster, said. "You've participated in all mandatory programs. Your institutional record shows no violations. Do you believe you're ready to rejoin society?" Corinne had thought about this question for years. She'd rehearsed the answer. But now, faced with the actual possibility of release, she found herself telling the truth. "No," she said. The board members exchanged glances. "Explain," Foster said. "I don't believe I'm ready because I'm not sure I understand why I did what I did well enough to guarantee I won't do something like it again," Corinne said slowly. "I was angry. I was envious. I convinced myself that invading someone else's life would fill the spaces in mine. I was wrong. But I'm not convinced I've changed enough to promise it won't happen again. I think I need more time." Foster looked down at her file. "Your therapist has indicated that you've made significant progress in understanding your motivations and in developing healthier coping mechanisms." "My therapist has to say that," Corinne said. "But the truth is I don't trust myself, and I think that's the most honest thing I can say to you." The board deliberated for 2 hours. When Corinne returned, Foster gave her the decision: conditional parole with a strict set of parameters. No contact with the Henderson family, no proximity to their neighborhood, regular therapy, random drug tests, a GPS monitor for the first year, a full-time job requirement. "Essentially," Foster said, "you'll be free but you'll be supervised. 1 violation and you're back here for the remainder of your sentence. Do you understand?" Corinne nodded. "Then congratulations, Miss Mitchell. You've been granted parole. You'll be released in 30 days pending housing and employment arrangements." The day Corinne was released from prison, it was raining. She was met at the gates by Patricia, her old public defender, who'd stayed in touch over the years out of a sense of duty or guilt or perhaps just because she believed in second chances. Patricia handed her a folder containing contact information for halfway houses, job training programs, and therapists who specialized in the kind of work Corinne needed. "I've set up an interview for you at a dry cleaning business about 15 miles from the Henderson neighborhood," Patricia said. "They're willing to hire ex-convicts. The pay isn't great, but it's steady work." Corinne took the folder. She was wearing clothes bought from a thrift store, jeans and a blue shirt that felt foreign on her skin after 4 years of prison clothes. Her hair had gone grayer. Her face had become harder, lined with years she'd spent inside. She was 46 years old and looked 55. "Thank you," she said to Patricia. "You're welcome. Now listen to me. You're going to have a really difficult next year. You're going to be tempted to go back, not to prison, but to the patterns that landed you here. You're going to feel envious of people who have what you don't. You're going to feel like the world owes you something. You have to fight those feelings. They will lead you right back to where you just came from." Corinne nodded. She knew this. She'd spent 4 years understanding this. The halfway house was in a residential area of the city, in a Victorian mansion that had been subdivided into small rooms. Corinne was assigned a room on the 3rd floor, a space barely larger than her prison cell, with a single window overlooking a street lined with other people's lives. She could see into windows. She could see the interior of homes, the arrangements of furniture, the choices people had made about how to live. She turned away from the window. The dry cleaning job was exactly as unglamorous as Patricia had warned. Corinne stood at the counter for 8 hours a day, taking in clothes, tagging them, processing payments. She folded garments that belonged to other people and listened to their small talk about their lives. She learned quickly to make her presence invisible, to take up no space, to exist as a service function rather than a person. It was actually, she realized after a few months, oddly healing. She had no aspirations about the job. She had no fantasy about transforming it into something more. She was simply here doing her work, earning her paycheck, using that paycheck to pay off her debt to the Hendersons. $30 a week went into a fund. At that rate, it would take her approximately 9 years to pay off the $15,000 restitution. She could accept that. She could live with that timeline. She also began to understand why people committed crimes. The cycle of poverty and desperation was not theoretical. It was lived in the margins. She began to recognize the signs in the women who came to her job, the worn clothes, the careful budgeting, the weight of circumstances pressing down. She also began to understand that her obsession with the Henderson family had never really been about them. It had been about herself, about the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become, about the gap between expectation and reality, about the refusal to accept the life she'd been given instead of the life she'd demanded. After 6 months, she requested a transfer to her permanent address, a small apartment in a part of the city where rent was affordable and the neighborhood was mixed enough that no one was paying attention to anyone else. She was assigned a new parole officer, a woman named Detective Williams, who was both strict and oddly compassionate. "You understand that you're on the hook for anything," Williams said during their first meeting. "You commit a crime, you fail a drug test, you miss a check-in, you're going back inside. Do you understand?" "I understand," Karen said. "Then let's make sure that doesn't happen." 2 years into her parole, Karen attended a support group for incarcerated women working toward reintegration. It met in a church basement every Thursday evening, and the women who attended ranged from recently released to 5 years out of the system. They talked about the difficulties of rebuilding, of managing trauma, of moving forward. A woman named Deshonda, not the same Deshonda from the county jail, shared her story about getting out and immediately relapsing, about the pull of old patterns, about the difficulty of becoming someone new. "I think the mistake I made," Deshonda said, "was thinking that getting out meant going back to who I was before, but that person doesn't exist anymore. I'm a different person now, and I need to figure out who that person is." Karen found herself nodding. She'd been trying to resurrect the old Karen Mitchell, the woman who'd had a good marriage and a nice house and a place in society. But that woman had also been the woman who'd felt entitled to other people's lives. That woman had also been the woman who'd broken into the Henderson home. Maybe, Karen thought, it was better that she was gone. She started volunteering at a community center, teaching basic financial literacy to women trying to rebuild their lives. She wasn't qualified in any official way, but she had experience in the worst possible financial decisions, and sometimes the most powerful teachers were people who'd lived the consequences. One evening, about 2.5 years into her parole, she ran into Sophia Henderson at the grocery store. Karen recognized her immediately, though Sophia had clearly aged in the years since Karen's arrest. There was gray in her hair now, and her face had a world weariness that Karen had put there. For a moment, Karen considered pretending she hadn't seen her. She could have turned down another aisle. She could have left the store. She could have made the encounter disappear. But she didn't. She approached Sophia slowly, her hands visible, her body language non-threatening. "Hello," Karen said quietly. Sophia looked up from her shopping list and went very still. Karen watched the moment of recognition, the moment of memory, the moment of all the fear and violation coming back. "I'm sorry," Karen said. "I'm not supposed to be anywhere near your neighborhood. I'm violating my parole conditions just by talking to you. But I wanted to. I needed to tell you something." Sophia didn't say anything. She just waited. "I got your letter," Karen said. "The one from prison, and I've thought about it every single day since. I want you to know that I understand what I took from you. I understand that I violated your sanctuary. I understand that my actions had consequences for your family, and I'm sorry for all of it. I've spent 3 years trying to become a different person than the woman who broke into your home. I'm not sure I've succeeded, but I'm trying, and I wanted you to know that I'm trying." Sophia's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm glad you're trying, and I'm glad you got out. I hope you find a good life, a real one, not the fantasy you were chasing before." "I hope so too," Karen said. She turned to leave, but Sophia called out to her. "Karen." Karen turned back. "I meant what I said in the letter. I forgave you a long time ago, not for you, for me, because I needed to let go of what you did so it wouldn't define the rest of my life." Karen nodded, unable to speak. She finished her shopping in a different aisle. She checked out without incident. She left the store and drove directly to her parole officer's office and reported the encounter herself. "You violated the conditions of your parole," Detective Williams said, not unkindly. "I did," Karen acknowledged. "It was the right thing to do and the wrong thing legally. I'm not asking for leniency. I'm reporting it because not reporting it would mean I'm still making my own rules about what matters and what doesn't." Williams considered her for a long moment. Then she made a note in her file. "I'm going to let this stand," she said. "But I want you to understand why. It's not because your violation was okay. It's because you demonstrated that you understand the structure you've been given and that you're willing to accept consequences for your choices. That's growth. That's what I want to see from you." By the time Karen's parole ended, 3 years after her release, she was a different woman than the one who'd entered the system. She was still affected by the trauma of incarceration. She was still managing the stigma of being a convicted felon. She was still navigating a world that was designed to exclude her. But she was also stable. She was employed. She was contributing to her community. She was paying off her debt slowly but consistently. She was in therapy. She was in a support group. She was building a life that, while not glamorous, was real and honest and entirely her own. On the day her parole officially ended, Detective Williams called her into her office. "You did the work," Williams said. "You followed the rules, you showed up, you didn't reoffend, you're officially released from supervision." Karen cried when she heard it, not from joy but from something more complex, the understanding that she was finally, truly free, not free from consequences, but free from the structure that had been holding her accountable. The question now was whether she would hold herself accountable. She thought about the night she'd first snuck through the fence at the Henderson house. She thought about the woman she'd been, desperate, envious, convinced that stealing someone else's life could fill the spaces in her own. She thought about the woman she'd been forced to become, and then the woman she'd chosen to become. She thought about Brutus, the dog who'd activated the alarm that first night. She'd looked him up once on a library computer and discovered that he'd passed away just before her release. Old age, the Henderson family had posted on their social media. He'd done his job. He'd protected his family. He'd been honored. Karen wasn't looking for honor. She was looking for the kind of peace that came from understanding that you'd earned exactly what was coming to you, and that redemption, if it was possible at all, required building something new rather than trying to resurrect what had been lost. She walked out of Detective Williams's office and into the afternoon sun. The city stretched out around her, a place full of other people's lives, other people's homes, other people's dreams. Karen had spent years obsessing over one woman's world. Now she had the opportunity to build her own. It would be nothing like the life she'd imagined. But it would be hers. The dry cleaning business had become a community center. Karen, who'd been working there for nearly 8 years, had partnered with the owner to create a program for formerly incarcerated individuals. They offered job training, financial literacy classes, and connections to resources that people coming out of the system desperately needed. Karen wasn't a therapist or a counselor. She was a woman with a record who understood the particular shame and struggle of trying to rebuild a life after prison. That made her qualified in ways that credentials never could. Sophia Henderson had reached out about a year after their grocery store encounter. She and Marcus had decided to use a portion of their wealth to fund reentry programs. When they learned that Karen was running one, Sophia had made a significant donation. "I wanted to do this," Sophia had said during the meeting where they'd discussed the donation. "Not for you, but because what you did made me understand how fragile people's lives are, how easily someone can slip into desperation, how important it is to have people who can help pull you back." They'd never become friends. The violation was too profound for that, but they'd achieved something perhaps more valuable, mutual understanding. Sophia understood that Karen had been drowning, and Karen understood that Sophia hadn't created the current. They'd simply both been swept up in it. Karen lived in a small apartment now, nothing fancy but clean and entirely her own. Her parole officer had long since passed supervision duties to someone else, and eventually all supervision had ended. She was simply a person living a life, working a job, contributing to her community. She'd paid off her debt to the Hendersons, the full $15,000 plus interest over a period of 7 years. She'd never told them it was done. They'd probably forgotten about the restitution payment, but she needed to know she'd repaid it. One Thursday evening, Karen was teaching a financial literacy class to a group of recently released women. They were learning about budgeting, about credit scores, about the practical mechanics of rebuilding a life. One of the women raised her hand. "Did you ever just want to give up?" the woman asked. "Like, did you ever feel like it wasn't worth trying anymore?" Karen paused. She thought about the woman she'd been in prison. She thought about the despair that had driven her to commit the crime in the first place. She thought about the slow, patient process of rebuilding. "Yes," Karen said. "I wanted to give up many times, but I learned something while I was incarcerated. The life I was chasing, the one that I thought I deserved, the one that I tried to steal by invading someone else's home, that life was never going to exist. It was a fantasy. And the more energy I put into chasing it, the less energy I had to build something real." She looked around the room at the faces of women, in various stages of their own rebuilding. "What I have now isn't glamorous, it's not what I thought I wanted, but it's honest, it's real, and it belongs to me because I built it, not because I tried to steal it from someone else." The woman nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what Karen was saying. That redemption wasn't about becoming who you used to be. It was about becoming someone new, someone better, someone who understood that the life worth living wasn't the one you could steal or fake or force into existence. It was the one you built, brick by brick, choice by choice, in the quiet places where no one was watching.